It all started with a single loud bark that echoed through the quiet cul-de-sac of Heather Ridge at precisely 6:13 a.m. By 6:17 a.m., Karen Moffat had already called the HOA. If you've ever dealt with an HOA, Karen, you know how quickly a tiny sound becomes a full-blown crisis. But this time, it wasn't just a noise complaint. This was the beginning of a neighborhood war that would spiral into lawsuits, police calls, and something even darker. If you're ready to hear what happens when a vindictive HOA enforcer goes head-to-head with a lovable town dog and a stubborn community, then buckle in. This story is going to shock you. And if you love true HOA drama and real justice being served, be sure to subscribe to Sham Stories, because this one gets wild fast. Now, Heather Ridge was one of those upscale suburban neighborhoods where everything looked perfect from the outside rows of trimmed hedges, white fences, identical mailboxes, and no one dared paint their shutters without prior written approval. Karen Moffat had been on the HOA board for 6 years and ruled with a clipboard in one hand and a citation form in the other. She had earned a reputation for enforcing the rules to a fanatical degree: fines for grass that was half an inch too high, warnings for holiday decorations that stayed up a day too long, and citations for garden gnomes that weren't community approved. So when a new neighbor, a retired firefighter named David Boone, moved into house number 43 with his golden retriever, Max, things were bound to go south. Max was everything you'd expect from a big, friendly retriever: curious, loud, and fiercely loyal. He had a habit of barking whenever someone approached the property, even if it was just the mailman or the wind rustling through the trees. For Karen, that bark wasn't just a noise, it was an offense, a disturbance to the peace and aesthetic order she claimed the community had agreed to preserve. So on that early morning in May, when Max barked for all of 7 seconds at a passing squirrel, Karen saw her opportunity. She marched out of her house in floral print slippers and robe, crossed the street with a camera phone in hand, and began recording Max through the slats of Boone's wooden fence. David, who was making coffee in his kitchen, noticed the figure on his property line and walked outside. He greeted her politely, but she responded with the kind of cold smirk that only a true HOA Karen could manage. "Your dog is in violation of HOA Noise Regulation Code 3.5. 2, she said. David raised an eyebrow and replied, "He barked at a squirrel." Karen didn't flinch. "That still constitutes a noise disturbance before approved morning hours," she said, already filling out a violation form on her clipboard. That was the beginning. David thought it was a misunderstanding, a minor annoyance, and figured it would blow over. But when he checked his mailbox later that day, the violation letter was already inside, time-stamped, signed, and stapled with a $150 fine. David was stunned. He went to the HOA office to appeal, but was met by Karen and to board members, one who looked bored and the other who seemed afraid to disagree with her. They refused to drop the fine. "It's not about the dog," Karen said. "It's about maintaining standards." When David asked what standards those were, she handed him a 147-page HOA handbook printed in fine legal text. The fight had begun. Over the next week, Max barked again, once when a garbage truck rumbled by, and once when Karen herself crossed the street carrying her clipboard. Each time, a new violation was logged. Karen began keeping a diary of every sound she attributed to Max. It escalated quickly. She filed a formal petition to classify Max as a nuisance animal under the HOA charter and sought to ban all pets over 25 pounds, lest they were emotional support animals certified by a licensed therapist. David, frustrated but patient, tried to reason with her. He installed a bar control collar, trained Max more rigorously, and even walked him during off hours to avoid confrontations. Still, Karen persisted. She began rallying other homeowners to complain, calling emergency HOA meetings, and standing across the street during Max's walks, glaring with her phone ready to record. David finally had enough and started documenting everything: recordings, video evidence of Max's behavior, noise level readings from his backyard, and every interaction with Karen. What he found was disturbing. Karen was falsifying timestamps on complaints, editing audio clips to make them sound worse, and even coaching other residents on what to say in official HOA grievances. She wasn't just annoyed by Max, she was obsessed. One neighbor, an elderly widow named June, admitted to David that Karen had pressured her into signing a complaint under threat of lawn violations. Another neighbor said Karen offered to waive his overdue landscaping fine if he supported her petition against Max. David compiled all this and submitted it to the HOA's ethics committee. But here's where things took an unexpected turn. Ethics committee didn't exist. Karen had dissolved it 2 years earlier and rewritten the bylaws so that all disciplinary appeals went through her directly as HOA president. David then took the matter to the town council, who said they had no jurisdiction over HOA internal matters unless criminal behavior was suspected. That's when David made his next move. He posted his story with documentation to the Heather Ridge neighborhood social page. The reaction was explosive. Dozens of residents commented with their own experiences of Karen's overreach. One family was fined for a hummingbird feeder, another for leaving a garden hose coiled in the wrong orientation. A retired Army veteran named Carl said he was cited for having an American flag that waved too aggressively on windy days. Karen tried to fight back, accusing David of harassment, slander, and coordinated misinformation campaigns, but it was too late. The residents had had enough. They demanded an emergency meeting and forced a community-wide vote to review the HOA leadership. Karen, predictably, refused to step down. That's when David found the one piece of leverage he didn't know he had, the town dog ordinance. According to city law, only animal control, not private HOAs, could label an animal as a nuisance. And all recordings had to be certified by a third party. Karen's entire campaign against Max was built on illegally gathered, privately interpreted noise reports. David submitted a formal complaint to animal control, not against Max, but against Karen. Animal control officers visited Heather Ridge, reviewed the footage, inspected Max, and declared him non-aggressive and well-trained. They then turned their attention to Karen, who had filed over 53 noise complaints in under 2 months, nearly all unfounded. The officers warned her that excessive false reporting was a violation of local code and carried a fine of up to $5,000. Karen's face turned a shade of red David would never forget. But the real blow came days later, when a former HOA treasurer, fed up with Karen's behavior, leaked years of financial reports that showed Karen had used HOA funds to cover legal consultations, personal landscaping, and community education. Seminars that were held in a private resort with no public attendees. Now the town wasn't just angry, they were calling for a criminal audit. The story had started with a bark, but now it had grown into something much louder, a community that was finally standing up. And at the center of it all was Max, the golden retriever, who, without ever knowing it, had taken down a tyrant one bark at a time. The fallout from Karen Moffat's abuse of power hit Heather Ridge like a summer storm sudden. It's loud and impossible to ignore. For the first time in years, residents who had once whispered their frustrations behind drawn blinds now marched into the HOA office in broad daylight, demanding accountability, receipts, and answers. And while Max, the golden retriever at the center of it all, wagged his tail, unaware of the chaos he'd inadvertently unleashed, Karen doubled down. She stopped smiling. She stopped walking the neighborhood. She stopped talking to anyone who didn't blindly support her authority. But behind her closed curtains and locked front door, she was strategizing. Her walls covered in HOA charters, violation codes, and printed screenshots from the neighborhood social page. She was furious, not just because her reputation was being publicly shredded, but because David Boone, a man she believed to be beneath her, intellectually and socially, had become the symbol of resistance. Karen didn't just want him fined or evicted anymore. She wanted him broken. So she filed a civil suit against David for defamation, trespassing, harassment, and emotional distress caused by the malicious encouragement of anti-HOA behavior. The suit was weak, legally speaking, but she had the resources. After all, she'd been using HOA funds for years to cover legal community protection expenses. The court accepted the complaint, and David was served. When the envelope came, thick with legal jargon and hollow accusations, he didn't panic. He'd seen it coming, and he was ready. His response wasn't just a defense, it was a countersuit. backed by over 40 sworn statements from fellow homeowners, financial records leaked by the former treasurer, audio evidence of coercion, and a formal complaint filed with the county attorney's office. His lawyer, a sharp-witted woman named Evelyn Sharp, who specialized in HOA abuse cases, told him he had more than a case, he had a public scandal in the making. Karen didn't realize how bad it was until local media caught wind of the story. At first, it was just a tiny segment. Neighborhood dog sparks HOA feud, but then the angle shifted. Reporters started digging into Karen's HOA history, connecting dots to complaints from years prior. One past resident, who'd quietly moved out after being fined 5 times in 1 month for wind chimes, came forward with documentation that Karen had manipulated board vote counts. Another man alleged that Karen had banned his daughter's lemonade stand for unauthorized sales activity, but accepted a $100 donation from another resident's child doing the same thing. The story snowballed. By the end of the week, Heather Ridge wasn't just a name on a map, it was a national talking point in the growing discussion around HOA overreach and neighborhood authoritarianism. Reporters knocked on doors, drones flew overhead for B-roll footage. Karen refused interviews but posted a 1,200-word statement on the HOA website, insisting she had been unfairly targeted by a vocal minority of residents led by a disrespectful dog owner and a slanderous social media mob. But her words no longer carried weight. The board, once firmly under her thumb, began to splinter. 2 members resigned within days. One released a public letter admitting he had signed violation forms he never read just to avoid her wrath. Cynthia Long, the newest member, who had once admired Karen's efficiency, now openly criticized her, saying, "This isn't governance, this is control, and it stops now." A vote to suspend Karen from her role as HOA president was scheduled. But before it could happen, Karen made a move no one expected. Late one night, she had a large steel kennel delivered and placed on her property line, technically within regulation, and began blaring recordings of barking dogs from a hidden speaker system. Every morning at 6:13 a.m., the exact time Max had barked months earlier. Her recordings played, echoing through the street. The message was clear: if they wanted noise, they'd get it. David reported her, but Karen claimed it was personal property audio and not subject to HOA restrictions. The neighbors, horrified but equally stubborn, began filming, documenting, and escalating. Animal control returned, this time with a noise expert. The sound recordings were ruled as nuisance behavior with intent to intimidate under municipal code. Karen was fined $1,000 and issued a cease and desist. She refused to pay. The legal battle between David and Karen dragged on, but support continued to pour in for him. Local fundraisers were held. A dog bakery donated custom Max-themed treats for neighborhood dogs. Children drew pictures of Max, taping them on community bulletin boards with messages like, "Let Max bark free," and "Dogs greater than rules." Meanwhile, Karen's yard became a fortress, blacked out windows, multiple cameras, and a sign that read, "Violators will be prosecuted." She rarely left her house, and when she did, it was late at night, dressed in hooded jackets and sunglasses. But her isolation only made the residents stronger. At the next HOA meeting, over 100 people packed the small hall. For the first time, the community demanded the reinstatement of a true ethics committee and the establishment of a rule that no board member could serve more than 2 consecutive years. The vote to remove Karen passed by a landslide. She was officially suspended pending the outcome of the civil trial. In retaliation, Karen released a smear newsletter, delivered anonymously to mailboxes, accusing David of having a criminal record. False, claiming Max had once bitten a child, also false. And listing names of other residents she claimed had defaced HOA integrity. The backlash was immediate. One homeowner filed a police report. Another confronted Karen directly at her door, filming the interaction as Karen screamed and slammed it shut. A city official issued a warning: any further misinformation or impersonation of HOA authority would result in criminal charges. Still, Karen wouldn't go down without one last attempt to win. She filed a motion to invalidate the community vote that removed her, citing mob rule and prejudicial interference by an emotionally manipulated populace. But the judge, after reviewing the footage, the complaints, the documents, and the mounting pile of evidence against her, denied the motion.
Oh.
Her face, once smug and untouchable, was now etched with disbelief. As her control slipped, Karen tried. A final tactic, she claimed mental health discrimination, saying the stress of dealing with unruly residents and their animals had caused her psychological trauma. Her legal team argued for leniency, citing emotional exhaustion and decades of unpaid HOA service. But David's lawyer dismantled the claim point by point, showing how Karen had willingly sought power, centralized it, and used it not to help, but to dominate. The judge agreed. The court date loomed, and as it neared, Karen made fewer appearances. Her lawn grew unkempt. The HOA, now under interim leadership, began to repair the damage she left behind, remersing wronged residents, correcting unjust citations, and re-establishing trust. On a sunny Saturday afternoon, the town hosted its first official Dog Day, a neighborhood celebration of pets. Max, proudly wearing a red bandana that said Bark Defender, was the star. David stood by, shaking hands, laughing with neighbors, and finally smiling again. But none of them knew that Karen, still lurking behind her curtain, was planning one last act, a desperate final move she believed would clear her name and ruin David's once and for all. Karen Moffat had never felt powerless a day in her life until now, and the weight of it was driving her mad. Stripped of her HOA presidency, ostracized by her neighbors, and facing a civil trial that had already been featured on 2 local news stations, she felt cornered in the very neighborhood she once ruled. But Karen wasn't the kind of woman who accepted defeat, and her mind, now consumed by rage, spun with schemes for revenge. She convinced herself that everyone was conspiring against her, especially David Boone and his dog Max, who in her twisted perspective had intentionally orchestrated her downfall. Alone in her house, Karen sifted through every email, every citation, every policy document she had archived over the years, searching desperately for anything she could weaponize. It was during one of these late-night digging sessions that she found something, a noise complaint filed months ago by a neighbor about another dog, one that had been dismissed due to lack of evidence. Karen smirked. She knew she couldn't directly harm David anymore, but she could destroy the very rules he now believed protected him. She filed multiple anonymous complaints to animal control using different resident names, claiming Max had become more aggressive, that he had bitten someone, that he chased a child. But the town, by now familiar with her tactics, flagged the complaints for review. Karen, undeterred, took it further. She mailed physical letters to the city council, to the county sheriff's office, and to a local newspaper, claiming the HOA was now run by a pro-dog anarchist who used mob pressure to suppress dissent and legal structure. Meanwhile, in Heather Ridge, things were slowly returning to normal. David, though cautious, began to relax. The new HOA leadership was responsive and fair. Violations were reviewed with proper due process. Community events were more frequent. Max was loved, petted, and even featured in a community newsletter titled Paws of Peace. Almost felt like closure until the letter arrived. Hand-delivered to David's mailbox with no return address, it contained a grainy black and white photo of Max in the Boone backyard along with a typed note. A dog's bark fades, but shame echoes forever. You haven't won. David immediately contacted his attorney. Evelyn Sharp took the threat seriously and filed a police report. A security system was installed at David's home. Surveillance footage was reviewed, and while it didn't catch the delivery, it did catch a figure short, hooded, moving quickly, dropping the envelope. Though blurry, the figure's walk, height, and stance looked familiar. David didn't need confirmation to know who it was. At the same time, the local paper ran a story titled "Disgraced HOA Leader Strikes Again," and quoted anonymous City Hall staff saying someone had been flooding them with bizarre letters accusing neighbors of building secret dogfighting rings and illegal pet grooming businesses. The story went viral in HOA forums, and Karen became an infamous meme, Barkwatch Karen. David stayed focused. The civil trial moved forward, and Karen's defense strategy unraveled fast. Her claims of emotional distress were undermined by evidence showing she had orchestrated anonymous harassment. Her accusations of defamation were destroyed when multiple residents testified, showing her pattern of abuse. One by one, witnesses recounted her violations, how she targeted single parents, the elderly immigrants, and pet owners with the same cold efficiency. A moment that stood out was when Carl, the Army vet, took the stand and recalled being fined for a flag that moved too much in the wind, nearly choking on emotion as he described how powerless she made him feel in his own home. The judge listened. The jury watched. Karen stared blankly, her usual smugness gone. But it wasn't just the court of law where Karen was losing. It was the court of public opinion. People in neighboring towns began holding their own HOA meetings inspired by what was happening in Heather Ridge. There were calls for HOA oversight legislation, ethics boards, and resident voting reforms. David's story had become more than personal. It was part of a movement, and still, Karen plotted. The night before her trial verdict was due, she attempted one final move. She accessed an old digital HOA archive and created a forged HOA memo claiming the entire current board had been illegally elected due to procedural errors. She printed it, slipped copies into mailboxes, and emailed local journalists. But the new board had already changed all official systems and logins. Her forgery was traced instantly. Police were notified. When they arrived at Karen's door, she answered in her robe, trembling not with fear, but fury. She screamed about corruption, lies, and betrayal. She threatened lawsuits. But this time, there were no sympathetic neighbors watching. No supporters. Just 2 officers, a warrant, and silence. She was arrested for harassment, document falsification, and obstruction of a court proceeding. The footage, of course, made the news again. The trial concluded the next day. David won. Karen was found liable for defamation, harassment, and emotional damage. She was ordered to pay fines, cover legal costs, and issue a formal public apology. The judge's statement was scathing. This court finds the defendant's actions to be a pattern of abuse cloaked in authority. The position of an HOA president is one of responsibility, not personal power. That trust was shattered. David didn't smile when the verdict was read. He didn't celebrate. He simply exhaled, his hand resting on Max's collar, knowing the war was finally over, or so he thought. Because while Karen had been stripped of every ounce of authority and respect she once had, something deeper had been unleashed, a growing network of people who shared her mindset. Online, anonymous groups began defending Karen, blaming David for turning the neighborhood into a circus and calling for a return to order. Flyers were found posted near Heather Ridge's entrance a week later, reading, "Protect our rules, take back our streets." David knew the battle might be over, but the ideology behind it wasn't dead. And as he looked out over his quiet yard, Max beside him, he realized the price of peace was eternal vigilance. The weeks that followed the final verdict in David Boone's case were both quiet and tense. Like the calm after a hurricane where the damage was still visible but the winds had passed. Heather Ridge had returned to its polished aesthetic, its clean sidewalks and freshly mulched flower beds, giving the illusion of normalcy. But beneath the surface, the neighborhood had changed forever. Max, the dog who'd unintentionally triggered a community uprising, had become something of a local legend. Kids drew chalk art of him on the sidewalk. A small hand-painted wooden sign reading Max's Corner had been placed next to the community garden. And residents often left him dog treats in a tiny mailbox mounted just for him. David had become the reluctant face of HOA reform, not because he wanted to, but because his quiet fight for fairness had turned into something much bigger. Invitations came in from other HOAs across the state, asking him to speak at reform meetings, help rewrite outdated rules, or simply tell his story. David obliged where he could, though he always kept one eye on his own street, wary of the leftover remnants of Karen's influence. Because while Karen herself was now unofficially banned from holding any future HOA position in the county, fined and forced into a public apology that aired on local access television, her ideology wasn't entirely erased. A few residents still whispered about the good old days of strict enforcement and order. One man who had signed a petition in Karen's favor before the fallout still kept his lawn edged like a military parade line, his passive-aggressive notes to neighbors never quite stopping. But the majority had changed. They spoke more openly. At meetings, they voted with clarity and purpose. The bylaws had been rewritten, this time in plain language, and distributed with a side-by-side guide explaining every resident's rights and protections. The Ethics Committee was restored, independent and empowered. The HOA newsletter, once a cold list of rule reminders, now included community birthdays, lost pet notices, and stories from neighbors. But for David, the healing wasn't complete. Until the city installed a bench at the park with a bronze plaque that read, "In honor of those who speak, even when silenced." It sat beneath an oak tree, the very one Karen had once tried to have cut down for dropping unsightly leaves, and became a quiet place where neighbors would stop, rest, and reflect. David often sat there with Max, watching the kids ride bikes. Dogs run leash-free during the allowed hours, and life returned to a natural rhythm. But even in peace, reminders of the storm lingered. One day, a letter arrived in David's mailbox. This time, it was from a woman named Melissa Crane, an HOA president in a nearby neighborhood called Brookside Glen. She wrote that her board had recently experienced its own internal struggle, with an aggressive leader trying to manipulate rules. In a way disturbingly similar to Karen's tactics, she'd heard about Heather Ridge's battle and wanted to meet. David agreed. When they met at a small coffee shop downtown, Melissa brought files, pages of complaints, altered documents, footage of threats disguised as enforcement. David looked through it all and realized this wasn't a coincidence. Behaviors, the language, the strategy, it mirrored everything Karen had done. That's when Melissa said something that made his stomach sink. Our board member, the one trying to take over, she was mentored by Karen Moffat. David couldn't believe it. Karen had not just been a local tyrant, she had been grooming others. Melissa explained that Karen used to run webinars and HOA leadership seminars, where she taught efficient enforcement and community standardization. Now it made sense why Karen had been so strategic, so organized, and so relentless. She had treated HOA dominance like a movement. She hadn't acted alone. Melissa asked David for help, not just with the current situation, but with exposing the broader issue. Together, they made a plan to contact other communities that had been affected by the same kind of leadership abuse. Within a few weeks, they formed a statewide advocacy group called Neighborhoods First. The mission was simple: protect homeowners from HOA overreach, educate communities on their rights, and build legal pathways for fair governance. David didn't set out to be an activist. He only wanted to live in peace with his dog. But the more stories he heard: the elderly man evicted over a misplaced potted plant, the family fined into foreclosure over minor paint inconsistencies, the veteran shamed for displaying a flag. The more he realized silence wasn't an option. His journey had started with a bark, but now it had grown into a roar. He testified at a state hearing where new legislation was being considered that would limit HOA powers, mandate transparent elections, and criminalize fraudulent citations. His testimony was powerful. Lawmakers, some of whom had never cared much for HOA drama, leaned forward in their chairs as he described the emotional toll, the intimidation tactics, and the betrayal of trust that came from unchecked authority. The bill passed committee, still had a long road ahead, but momentum was building. And all the while, back in Heather Ridge, Max continued living his best life, barking when the wind rushed too hard, rolling in the grass, and accepting belly rubs from neighbors who once feared their dog might get them fined. The community had changed, and it had started with one man and his dog daring to push back. Karen Moffat eventually moved away. Rumor said she relocated to a rural town, far from HOA bylaws and neighborhood scrutiny. But every now and then, someone in the HOA world would stumble across a comment online from a suspicious account defending aggressive enforcement, referencing the need for order and claiming dogs don't pay dues. And whenever that happened, someone would reply with 2 words: ask Heather Ridge. 'Cause now, Heather Ridge stood as a symbol not of control, but of courage. Of what could happen when residents stood up, spoke out, and refused to be bullied in their own homes? The story had reached its end, but the movement was just beginning. And if you believe every community deserves to be fair, if you've ever dealt with HOA madness, or if you just love seeing power finally held accountable, subscribe to Sham Stories for more true drama, real justice, and bold battles against modern-day Karens.